All right.
Wow, that's an intimidating introduction. So the future of cross-platform front-end development, it was interesting because when they had asked me to speak at this conference, I said, well, okay, I need a title. Do you have any suggestions? And they said, well, it is the future of web design. Can you make sure you have the future of somewhere in there? So I have the future of cross-platform front-end development, which sounds very ominous. And apparently I was the only presenter here that decided to add the future of to any of their titles. So this screen is intentionally blank. It's a blank canvas. And imagine for a moment that you're speaking to a client and you ask, okay, what kind of content do you have? Very common question. We don't have any content yet. We haven't written anything yet. Okay. How about like a logo, something that we can use to base the design off? Well, we're just starting a business, so we don't actually have a logo yet. Okay. So what's your audience? You've got a product. Who are you making this site for? Well, we certainly don't want to limit ourselves, the client says, that we want it to be for everybody. So, the more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself. You need constraints in order to be able to design, effectively. And of course, there's a lot of things that we can do to help us design. We can use things like the golden rule. So the Twitter site, for example, as you might have seen if you were in Doug Bowman's session, the Twitter site uses the golden rule to manage its layout. This is one of those constraints that help us design. It allows us to define certain rules that we can lay out against. It makes our lives easier. It frees ourselves because we no longer have to think about where things should be placed. As Ethan had mentioned in his session, grid systems, extremely popular because, again, they create a constraint for us to design against. The 960 GS system, where we have a very flexible system, whether it's a 16, 12, 8, 4, that we have all these different widths and columns that we can use to design against. But this is really just the beginning. When we look at designing and developing for a product, small or large, there's two things that we should really be looking at. One is reducing and one is reuse. I'd say recycle, but I couldn't really think of a way of associating it. So reduce and reuse. So how do we reduce and reuse? One of the things is to reduce variations. If we have multiple column views, should they be differing widths or should they be using the same width? How consistent can we create things? Reducing the number of components that we have within a site. 37 Signals very much extols the idea of simplicity. Don't build features. That we can stick to the majority of what users want as opposed to what all users want. That it helps dilute the product if we start throwing in too many things that we don't need. We can reuse patterns. So things that we have in certain elements of the page, that we can use those over and over again. And the important part is to be consistent. So on a recent project, a number of people working on the team, and over time, inevitably things kind of build up, this sort of cruft of design. And one of the things that we had attempted to do is do an audit and say, okay, where are we on things? So things like font size. We didn't really have a font system. A designer would build out their comp for their particular page, and then the prototyper or the engineer would come in and they would implement it. And by the end of this process, after 8, 9 months, we had actually run into a situation where we had 15 different font sizes being specified for our page. And obviously that was extremely unnecessary. So it was a matter of going back through that process and saying, okay, well, we don't necessarily need things at 18 and 20. We could probably just settle on 20. We don't need 10, 11, and 12. We can probably just settle on 12. And so one of the interesting things to note here is, as a developer, it's also your responsibility for consistent design. That it's not just a matter of taking the design comps that a designer gives you. It's a matter of looking at what you need to implement and making it consistent, because you're the one building out the HTML and the CSS, and possibly the JavaScript, and possibly the back end. All these different components, it's just simply more work that you have to maintain. So the more consistency we have, the easier it is to maintain. So modularity. Now, if we start looking at building a system of reusable components, and how do we reuse those components? So one of those concepts is object-oriented CSS. Nicole Sullivan, this is her brainchild. And I'm going to give a particular example of something that actually she has on her website. If you haven't seen this article, it's a really great one. The short URL at the bottom if you happen to have your laptop and want to check it out now. And the idea is the media object. So with the media object, it says, well, I've got, let's say, an icon or a picture on the left, and I've got a block of text on the right. And these are a bunch of different examples. So whether the icon's big or small, doesn't really matter on size. It's just still the exact same pattern over and over again. Doesn't matter if it's text or a text box or anything else, it's the exact same pattern over and over again. So she took a look at Facebook and saw this exact same pattern. You can see how many times it's being repeated. That's a lot of exactly the same thing. So when we start to look at the implementation for that, the code is actually rather minimal. So we've defined this div with a class of media for this particular piece. We have our image, which could be linked or not, and then we actually have our body. This is the actual text information that we have. And we can nest within that if we want. So we can reuse this component over and over again. And the CSS for that, again, is very minimal. There's not a whole lot to that in order to get that layout that we want. So as was mentioned, I do work for Yahoo, and basically the work that I've been working on for the past 9-10 months was Yahoo Mail, Yahoo Messenger. We actually just released within the last 2 weeks the new Yahoo Mail beta. So one of the things I want to do is kind of go over some of the things that we do to really approach our modularity, how we approach components, and hopefully you can take something away from that. So here is a couple screenshots that we have. One is Android on the left, iPhone on the right. And I want you to see sort of the consistency that we have tried to create between the two. Yes, fonts are different, and that's a limitation of the platform. Android only gives us certain fonts. The iPhone only gives us certain fonts. But we can still create a certain consistency in the layout and the iconography that we use. So we still have the top bar, which is purple, but hard to tell on the screen. We have, the back button. We've got the edit button. We've got the little purple icon indicating that it's a new message. We've got the forward and reply icons. It's the exact same format between the two. So then we go to the actual web page, and you can see some similar elements. Yes, we've got the icon for the new. We've got the same iconography for attachments. But the interesting thing here, from a code perspective, the HTML that actually powers this can actually be exactly the same between the two. So I'll get into another example here. We have, off the side, is a contact list. So within that contact list, again, you can kind of see that media pattern that we saw before. Icon on the left, content to the right. And it's exactly the same pattern that we can reuse on the desktop application. Exactly the same layout, exactly the same design for a desktop application as well. So we can reuse exactly the same components from place to place. So I'm going to give you another example. Buttons. We have a lot of buttons. It's a very button-heavy interface. There's just a lot to do. You look at the top, we have search mail and search web. We have our toolbar with compose, delete, reply. Along the left side, we have our refresh icon or delete icons. We have these rather large action buttons in the content area. If you're looking to compose, we have sort of the Apple Mail-esque lozenges We had to come up with a name for that. I don't know what people call it. We came up with pill, we came up with lozenge is what we ended up settling on. But we also have like our attachments. Very similar, except we have the delete button on the side or the refresh icon. We also have dialogues, which have OK and cancel buttons and any other actions that we might have. So in this case, where we have all these different components, we don't have separate CSS for every single button. What we do is we have a base button class that defines global properties across all of these. So the lozenge height is exactly the same height as the send cancel buttons. It's exactly the same as our delete and refresh icons on the side. They all have the same rounded corners, and we can start to create some consistency. When the only difference ends up being color, then we can override that with a specific class. So our lozenge class only has to override the color for that particular lozenge as opposed to having to recreate all those styles. So by creating this repetition and only subclassing for specific components, we see a lot of optimizations. So then we start to look at the HTML aspect of this. How do we actually break that down? So in this kind of graph, we start at the page level, and the page will be broken down into certain components. You've got your left navigation, header, footer, and content. Your content area might actually be broken up into subcomponents, let's say the message list or the message preview. The message preview gets broken down into components, and so on. And so by doing this kind of modularity, it allows us to reuse these components in different places. We actually build out our system using a templating language called Mustache. The reason why we chose Mustache was because it is a very straightforward syntax. I'll show you an example of that. So in this example, the double curly braces indicates a mustache variable or a mustache block. The advantage of this is that it is language agnostic. It's not PHP, it's not Java, it's not JavaScript, it's just a template language. And a lot of systems do have processors for that. So whether or not it is JavaScript, so we can actually take a JSON variable or object and actually compress that and compile it with this template to actually generate what we're looking for. So in this case, we've got the pound contact card details indicates a block. So we have an open and close tag, basically, in order to declare this. And so if the JSON data exists, it will actually render this. If it doesn't exist, this will never appear. And then we can go through and actually create, so with the greater than signs indicates a partial, we can actually load other mustache templates and import it into here. So we can reuse things like buttons and pull those buttons into different dialogues and different components on the screen. So I think one of the interesting things here is that when we actually develop the CSS, is that we actually develop the CSS to match the template files. Now, before I worked at Yahoo, a lot of the projects that I worked on were certainly smaller in scope. Blogs, I definitely put together a lot of blog sites for small applications. And my penchant was for doing everything in a single file. This is the way I knew, this is the way I understood how one should approach web design. I know that kind of goes against what a lot of other people tend to do. Yahoo certainly demonstrated that when you start working on larger and larger systems, that it can be impractical to try to compile everything into a single style sheet. So our systems kind of break down into three different things. We've got the page level, we've got the module level, and we've got the fragment level. So the page level is things like the inbox, the compose. The module might be the specific message list or the message view. And then the fragments are the individual components pulled into that. So on the CSS side of things, we have sort of the general files that apply to everything. We have fonts that apply to everything. We have a master layout that says we've got a header, we've got a footer, and we have our content area. Buttons, because they're throughout the application, forms, lists, media. But then we have the ability to create specific style sheets for specific modules, whether that be the message list or the contacts or the menus or the dialogues. So I'm going to go back to, this is a slightly different example, kind of looks like the inbox. This is actually search results. So with the search results, it looks kind of like a message list, but now we have these little snippets underneath. So we kind of have this message list, so we can use the message list CSS file that we had created, but now we can subclass this and actually create a search style sheet that allows us to target just this particular page. So there's certain advantages to this. Of course, performance was really one of the key things that we were after. We wanted to make sure that we could speed this up and do that in a number of ways. So one of the ways that we wanted to do that was reduce the amount of HTML and the number of images that we were using by using CSS3. We're not doing 3, 4 different levels of HTML where we've got div inside of a div inside of a div. We can use things like border radius and gradients to do the stuff that we want. And unfortunately, I realize I've just duplicated one of my slides. So CSS3 you can use right now. Border radius, gradients, drop shadow, multiple backgrounds. It's interesting because like one of those questions that I think a lot of people have is like it's not quite ready. Worried about IE. There's not enough browsers that are ready enough to do the stuff we want. I'm going to say don't be afraid. There are a lot of performance gains to be had by taking these approaches. One of those things is don't be afraid to use IE filters. I think there's a lot of power in this. Yes, it's a tool. It's an antiquated tool. It's a tool that's hopefully going away, thankfully going away. But for now, this is a tool that we have and one we can take advantage of. So we can do things like gradients. We can specify a start color and end color. It's limited. It only goes from top to bottom. Actually, I'll show you. Top to bottom, left to right. We can't change the angle to it. So it's not like the Mozilla or CSS gradients where we can actually declare what direction that is. We can't create multiple stops of colors. We can only specify a start and end color. But for our needs, that's exactly what we needed. So it came in very handy. We can mimic RGBA, something that the IE doesn't have right now. So you may notice the difference between these two slides is just 2 extra values before the color. So the 2 extra values before the color is our alpha value. And so we can actually mimic RGBA. We can do these semi-transparent or semi-opaque gradients or solid colors to mimic RGBA that other browsers have. We can do box shadow. So again, we can specify the color of the drop shadow and then the X and Y offset. Again, we may not have exactly the same power that a lot of the other browsers do, but we do have this kind of capability in IE that we can use these tools now. We can pull off multiple backgrounds in the sense that we can actually create multiple filters and combine that with a regular background with one caveat. If you're using multiple backgrounds, normally the way things layer is top to bottom. The exception here is that the filter actually acts as a layer in between the text and the border and the background. So it actually appears in between those two. So it's just something to be aware of when actually implementing this. But we get some definite performance gains by doing this. We can reduce by compiling only what's needed for load time. So for example, what happens when a user actually loads up the first page within Yahoo Mail? Yes, they get the header. Yes, they get some left navigation. And maybe they get their inbox. They don't have their compose. They don't have their updates. They don't have anything else. They've only got their inbox. So the only thing we have to worry about loading is just that. So then I talked about before where all the CSS is modularized to match with the mustache files that we're using. Since we know exactly what mustache files are being used when the first page loads up, we know exactly how much CSS that we need to load. We load our general stuff, our global stuff, and then we load the stuff specific to that view that we're loading. And then everything else, if we know we're going to need dialogues, we know we're going to need menus, we can start loading that stuff up behind the scenes. So we can see some very good performance gains as a result of that. Of course, we can lessen the amount of HTML and CSS that we're actually using in the page. We don't have to do multiple divs to create the styles. We don't have to create all these style hooks to be able to create the interface that we're looking for. And by modularizing things the way we do, we can actually decrease the time required to prototype and build. So yes, we've built Yahoo Mail, but we also have Messenger, we have Calendar, we have Notepad. We have a lot of products that now need to have the same consistent look and feel. We now have all these different components that we can reuse. We don't have to reinvent the wheel as we move on. So this gives us a lot of power to be able to move quicker and iterate faster, which I think is really important. And so we can reuse all these building blocks on future products. I think this is really impressive. The fact that we were able to reduce the application size over the wire, so this isn't back-end development, this is strictly all the front-end code that we have to send over the pipe. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we were able to reduce the application size by 35%. That was a huge gain because we didn't have to do all the old code that we wanted. It was interesting. I remember actually at the beginning of the project, we had created our prototype, just a static look and feel for this project. And to give you some background, I work on the prototype team, which means that I don't really touch any of the PHP or any of the back end, just strictly work on the front end to actually build these prototypes from the designers, and then work with the engineers to actually get this stuff implemented. So the actual HTML and CSS that we build for our prototypes is the actual HTML and CSS that gets used in the final product. But at the beginning of the project, we had talked to a bunch of engineers, and they're like, well, why don't you just use our existing HTML? We've already done it. We've already solved all the problems. The problem was that all their HTML and all the problems they had solved was 5 years old. Yes, their site worked great on IE5, but that was no longer an audience that we had to worry about. When we first launched the Yahoo Mail beta, we didn't have IE6 support. We actually didn't even have IE7 support. We only supported IE8 out of the box. And so worrying about IE5 wasn't really a consideration. You know, we didn't necessarily need to use tables for layout in order to get the design the way we wanted. And we were able to address a lot of things like accessibility and get those components into individual things, into individual modules. And I think that's a really good thing. When you can reuse a lot of the things, especially on accessibility, you know, a lot of the ARIA roles and whatnot that we had to work on to get nailed down to make sure that things worked properly, we don't have to, again, reinvent the wheel for every single new component that we were building. That we built that once, you know, how our menus worked, how that interacted with the buttons, how users could navigate with the keyboard. We create a system, and then we reuse that system over and over again. And I think that's really important. So as a result of all that work, we were able to cut the load time in half. You know, the fact that we were able to get these kind of performance gains was fantastic. So with that said, I realized that was actually somewhat of a brief shot. So let's chat afterwards. Let's chat now. If anybody has any questions about some of the stuff that we did, open answering.
So you guys decreased your load time quite a bit by doing a lot of these things like putting our CSS together and stuff like that. What's your opinion specifically on stripping out HTML elements that maybe are semantically necessary, but not necessarily necessary for display purposes, just to reduce more of the load?
So the question was, what are my thoughts on stripping out elements that are pertinent for semantics?
So like LIs, wrapping an A, you have like a big list of LIs, and you have links inside of those. Maybe just using the wrapper div and stripping out all the LIs and just using the A's and styling them as if normal like.
Right. So if we start looking at, you know, should we start reducing our HTML just for performance reasons and start losing out some of the semantics, and what are the semantic gains, you know, are those semantic gains necessary or useful? And I'll give you an interesting story. So one of the things is our message list. That looks like a table. should be a table. You've got columns, you've got rows. The problem is we do a lot of dynamic data insertion, and tables are notoriously, for lack of a better term, a pain in the ass to work with JavaScript. And so when we reapproach this, okay, well, we're turning this into a list. So we have a bunch of list items, but in order to make sure from accessibility perspective that we were still meeting the goals that we wanted to achieve, we layered this with ARIA roles on top of that. What was interesting is that once we had done that, we actually put that to accessibility testing and then started to see some of the downfalls to that. And it's something that's not obvious right off the bat. Somebody with a screen reader actually has to go in and test that and see what's going to happen. And the problem was is that the list and the semantics and the functionality gained from that actually conflicted with the ARIA roles that we had set. So in that particular case, we did actually strip out the list items for that because of the accessibility gains for that. In a lot of cases, it's going to come down to testing. And unfortunately, our landscape is a lot wider now than it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. My day is no longer dealing with IE4 and Netscape 4. It's dealing with 4 different versions of every single browser, plus localized versions of browsers, plus mobile platforms, plus desktop platforms. There's now all these different environments that we have to test for. And sometimes the only way we can solve these problems is by actually testing them and seeing what's going to happen. Any other questions?
Can you talk a little bit more about how you're serving the different CSS? I mean, is it multiple style sheets that get loaded in, or are you dynamically building one style file or come back?
So the question was how we're actually serving up all the multiple CSS files. So we do have a combo loader. We do a combo loader not only for the CSS but also for the JavaScript. It basically says, okay, I need this, 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 and this. It'll automatically compile, compress, strip out all the comments, and basically send as little information over the pipe as possible. And it's exactly the same thing for the JavaScript. We will compile, compress, gzip in order to send the least bit of information over the pipe.
What kind of things do you guys reuse? Are you just reusing CSS for like heights on buttons? Are you doing it for like certain margins and padding items too?
So the question is, are we reusing things like margins and paddings as opposed to just heights and specific things like that? Not as much.
What do you see yourself grouping mostly? What do you see yourself reusing a lot?
One of the things that Nicole Sullivan talks about is really kind of taking a look at the patterns and trying to abstract a lot of that stuff away. And for us, it's very much the same thing. So yeah, we have lists. Yeah, we have things that we start to see exactly the same. You're right, margins and paddings on things, that we have certain layouts that we're reusing over and over again. So we have certain column layouts. I think another good example is forms. So we have forms in a number of different places. Things like dialogues where you have to create a new folder. Pops open a dialog, type in some information, and close that down. Or you go into options, and you've got field labels on the left, form fields on the right. And again, this was kind of a situation where we had forms in a bunch of different places. We had developers who worked on options, who worked on contacts, who worked on dialogues, and everybody basically went to the Photoshop document as their reference. So as a result, they're like, well, for this, I need a label width that is about 100 pixels. The other person was like, well, for mine, because my design says it needs to be 250, I will use 250 for that. And it was a matter of going back over that and actually taking a look and saying, well, okay, you know what, we need to be more consistent with this. With dialogue sizes, we actually realized we had 6 different dialogue sizes. We don't need to be creating this much overhead. We can go back over. We actually have a process. It's 3 weeks of development, 1 week of cleanup. And this is our cycle that we go through, our cadence that we use within our team. We do that on the design side, so the designers actually go back to their Photoshop documents. So if something was developed and they realized, okay, you know what, now that we've redesigned this particular component, we now need to go back over all the Photoshop documents and clean those up. Because if anybody goes back to them as a reference, they may implement it incorrectly. So there's this cleanup process where we can go back over things, clean things up. And it's the same thing on the HTML and CSS side, that we can go back through and say, okay, did we do this correctly? Where are some performance gains that we can have with this? We don't need to specify 15 different font sizes, we only need to specify a few. And so I think it's always a good process to go back over the stuff that you created. I know for a lot of people it's about build, 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 that they don't have time to go through that cleanup process. But I would say there's a lot of performance gains, not only from a user's perspective, but even in a team perspective, because you're not wasting time developing things to a reference document that no longer applies, or you're no longer fixing bugs in 5 different places. You're only fixing it in one, because you only have one reference for that particular component. Any more questions? It's also the top one over here.
It sounds like you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're creating unique combined style sheets for each section or page of the site. So when we get to like the inbox combined certain, is there a better performance gain doing it that way as opposed to using caching and having like the general style sheet always cached downloaded once across the
So the question is are we compiling all the components for each individual page, which actually is not the case. So the loader is aware of what style sheets it has already loaded. So it knows that when it first loads up, it has loaded the general style sheets, and it now only needs to load the style sheets for those specific components that is loaded. So when it goes to load the dialog, it doesn't have to reload all the general stuff. It only has to load the dialog stuff. You know, if it's already loaded the form stuff, it'll only load up all the things necessary for that component. So over time, you actually, again, get these performance gains because of that. And as we build out more and more products on the exact same framework, that the users of each individual product will again continue to see the performance gains because of caching, because a lot of these components, the general stuff has already been loaded, that we're only loading up the key components for each individual module. Question at the back?
Can you share with us what other frameworks you guys are using aside from Mustache, possibly YUI?
So other frameworks that we're using besides Mustache and of course YUI. Interesting on the YUI front, at the beginning of the project, you know, despite the fact that we are Yahoo, we actually went through the due diligence to say, should we be using any other JavaScript framework? I think it's important as engineers, even though we have our own products, do we look outside of our company to see what kind of products are out there? I think the Mustache templating system is an example of that. It's an open source product that we can take in, use, and possibly push changes back into that product. So when we were looking at JavaScript libraries, you know, we looked at jQuery, and admittedly one of the advantages for us was code ownership, which for us was really kind of a big deal. If there is a bug in somebody's system, yeah, we can fix it, but there is that overhead time to understand and actually fix those issues before putting them back. So if you think something like jQuery, the core library is fantastic, but then it's a matter of, okay, well, I need a menu system. I now need a widget for that. Do you go to a plugin that somebody has created? Do they still maintain it? Are they getting all the accessibility issues, all the localization issues? Which is another thing when it comes to our templating. The fact that all our language strings as well are externalized and are compiled, that we do that on the JavaScript side as well. Do all the jQuery plugins have that kind of functionality built in? Whereas we know with YUI that it has that framework built in and is included with the widgets that get built. And it was even so much of, you know, when we started looking at, okay, we're going to use YUI, what widgets should we use? Can we go to the YUI gallery, which again is open, that people can push towards? And we came to the realization that even a lot of those components we can't necessarily rely on because we don't know, you know, what is the overhead of having to go back to actually update and keep that component updated. You know, when you have a team of people available to you, you know, we can go to the YUI team and say, can you fix this for us? And they'll turn it around within a week. You know, we can't necessarily go to, let's say, John Ressig. You know, he's a great guy, but he's got a lot of things to manage, and he can't necessarily be at our beck and call to fix things that we want to have within the library. As far as other frameworks, that we have within Yahoo, admittedly, very little. All our CSS is hand-coded. All our HTML is hand-coded. On the PHP side of things, we have our own framework that we use for building stuff. One of the nice things about using the mustache templating was the fact that we're creating code that's getting distributed to multiple teams. So we have a mail team, and their stuff is in PHP. The front-end team has their stuff in JavaScript that we can deploy the mustache stuff to those teams. But the calendar stuff, a lot of their implementation was actually still in Java from when we acquired the calendar product from another company. But the fact is that there's a Java implementation of Mustache, so we can still deploy our templates to that team and again still maintain that consistency. But as far as that, there's been very few frameworks that we actually use. With that said, there are a lot of good frameworks out there. I think when it comes to maintenance, is always a big question. Things like Less and Sass, I think, are two very popular ones, which help with maintenance. They can help with the design of complex systems because they give you a sense of inheritance beyond just using multiple classes, that you can actually say, okay, well, I've got, let's say, border radius. I hate specifying border radius 4 different ways. I'd love to just specify it once. So you could actually create a less variable that has all those declarations and then include that variable throughout your application. So you're just saying border radius once, and then the processor at build time will then compile that and use all the different variations for the stuff that you're doing. So I'll take maybe one more question, and I think we'll wrap it up. One in the middle here.
How are you doing JS and CSS versioning?
So was the question for versioning for JavaScript and CSS? So our versioning, we use Subversion as our version control system. Beyond that, it's kind of hard to describe. It is all based on Subversion. We do branching within Subversion. So for a particular point, we'll branch off, make any bug fixes and whatnot that we need to do. And then as we build out new components, we'll build that out in the trunk. And then for a particular team, they pull only from a specific branch. They're never pulling from our trunk. So as we reach a certain stage and we've reached a certain point with the functionality that we have within the trunk, we then push those changes to a particular branch for that particular team to pull on. And then once they've implemented, then we can address actual implementation bugs, browser bugs, things that we see, take those changes, bring them back into that branch, and then pull those changes all the way back to trunk. So because of the multiple teams that we have to deal with, it does get a little crazy, especially as we start deploying components. It's actually probably our biggest headache right now, is dealing with multiple branches. So thank you very much. Hope that was enjoyable, and enjoy the rest of your day.